From NBC News in Washington, this is Meet the Press with David Gregory.
This Sunday, a country divided and the president facing tough issues that invoke passionate debate on both sides. Is there a way to get past the arguments and find consensus on health care reform, the role of government, and the way forward in Afghanistan? Our guest, the President of the United States, Barack Obama. Then, the view from the other side of the aisle on the big challenges and hard choices. With us, the Republican leader in the House, Congressman John Boehner of Ohio, and the senior senator from South Carolina, Lindsey Graham. Plus, our political roundtable.
I think an overwhelming portion of the intensely demonstrated animosity toward President Barack Obama is based on the fact that he is a black man, that he's African American.
President Obama responds to the former president and blames the media for fueling the fire.
I mean, this is catnip to the media. This debate that's taking place is not about race, it's about people being worried about how our government should operate.
Insights from Washington Post columnist Gene Robinson and Politico columnist Roger Simon.
But first, the President of the United States. Friday afternoon, I sat down with President Obama in the Roosevelt Room at the White House. Mr. President, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Great to see you.
This is a critical moment in the health care debate. And you've been able to assess the landscape. You've got a bill now that's working its way through the Senate. You've spoken to Congress. As you assess the situation, I wonder whether you approach this with a minimum threshold of what you'll accept for reform, or at this point have you said, I've laid out my plan, take it all or nothing?
You know, I think that my focus is on some core principles. I have to have a plan that is good for middle-class families who we know last year ended up seeing a 5.5% increase in their premiums, even though inflation was actually negative on everything else, that have seen a doubling of their premiums over the last decade, that are less secure than ever in terms of the insurance they can actually count on, and more of them can't get insurance because of pre-existing conditions, or they changed jobs, or they lost jobs. So it's got to be good for them. Now, the principles that we've talked about, making sure that there's an insurance exchange that allow people to buy in and get health insurance and negotiate as a big pool to drive down costs, making sure that we have insurance reforms that make sure you can still get health insurance even if you've got a pre-existing condition, and cap out-of-pocket expenses and so forth. Those core things that make insurance a better deal for American consumers. Making sure that it's deficit neutral, both now and in the future. Making sure that it's driving down healthcare inflation so that we can actually deal with our long-term budget deficits. Those are the core principles that are critical to me. And I actually think that we've agreed to about 80% of that. If you look at all the bills that are coming through all these committees, the key is now just to narrow those differences. And if I don't feel like it is a good deal for the American people, then I won't sign a bill.
Those narrow differences can also, in some cases, be very big differences. And as you were president-elect last year, you said to the nation, in light of the huge challenges that the country faces, you said, we're going to have to make hard choices, and not all of these choices are going to be popular. What are the hard choices that you are now asking the American people to make? And who are you going to say no to in order to get health care done?
Well, I've already made some pretty substantial changes in terms of how I was approaching health care. When I was
like the public option, you effectively said to the left,
well,
that's not going to happen.
No, that's not true. What I've said is that public option, I think, should be a part of this, but we shouldn't think that somehow that's the silver bullet that solves health care. What I've said, for example, on what's called an individual mandate. During the campaign, I said, look, if health care is affordable, then I think people will buy it. So we don't have to say to folks, you know what, you have to buy health care. And when I talk to health care experts on both the left and the right, what they tell me is that even after you make health care affordable, there's still going to be some folks out there who, whether out of inertia or they just don't want to spend the money, would rather take their chances. Unfortunately, what that means is then you and I and every American out there who has health insurance and are paying their premiums responsibly every month, they've got to pick up the cost for emergency room care when one of those people gets sick. So what we've said is, as long as we're making this genuinely affordable to families, then you've got an obligation to get health care, just like you have an obligation to get auto insurance in every state.
Are these the hard choices, though? Who are you saying
Well,
no to?
I mean, that's an example of a hard choice, because that's not necessarily wildly popular, but it's the right thing to do. I have said that it is very important that we take into account the concerns of doctors and nurses, who, by the way, support our efforts. And that's something that doesn't get noticed much. The people who are most involved in the healthcare system know that it's got to be reformed. But I've said that we've got to take into account their concerns about medical malpractice. Now, that's not popular in my party, never has been, but I've talked to enough doctors to know that even though it's not the end-all be-all of driving down healthcare costs, it's very important to providers to make sure that their costs are going down. So I think there are going to be a whole series of Republican ideas from my opponents during the campaign that we have incorporated and adopted. And this is hard. One of the things I've always said is, if this had been easy, it would have been taken care of by Teddy Roosevelt.
You're not really taking on, I mean, you're not saying to the left they've got to accept malpractice reform or caps on jury awards. You don't even think that contributes to the escalating cost of health care. What are you really doing to say to the left, look, you may not like this, but you got to get on board or we got to do this?
Well, listen, I think I was awfully clear, and I'm surprised, David, maybe you haven't been paying attention to what both the left and the right have been saying about my speech to Congress. I laid down some pretty clear parameters, and what I said was, we're going to take ideas from both sides. The bottom line is that the American people can't afford to stay on the current path. We know that, and that both sides are going to have to give some. Everybody's going to have to give some in order to get something done. We wouldn't have gotten this far if we hadn't been pretty insistent, including to folks in my own party, that we've got to get past some of these ideological arguments to actually make something happen.
This healthcare debate, as you well know, can sometimes be about bigger things. And among your harshest critics is the view somehow that government is out of control. And in some cases, it's gotten very personal. Your election, to a lot of people, was supposed to mark America somehow moving beyond race. And yet this week you had former President Jimmy Carter saying most, not just a little, but most of this Republican opposition against you is motivated by racism. Do you agree with that?
No. Look, I said during the campaign, are there some people who still think through the prism of race when it comes to evaluating me and my candidacy? Absolutely. Sometimes they vote for me for that reason, sometimes they vote against me for that reason. I'm sure that was true during the campaign, I'm sure that's true now. But I think you actually put your finger on what this argument's really about, and it's an argument that's gone on for the history of this republic, and that is, what's the right role of government? How do we balance freedom with our need to look after one another? I talked about this in the joint session speech. This is not a new argument, and it always invokes passions. It was a passionate argument between Jefferson and Hamilton about this. Andrew Jackson built a whole political party around this notion that somehow there's populist outrage against a federal government that was intrusive. And so what I think is going on is that we've got a healthy debate taking place. The vast majority of people are conducting it in a very sensible way. I think that every president who's tried to make significant changes along these lines, whether it was FDR or Ronald Reagan, elicit very strong, passionate responses. But I do think that we all have an obligation to try to conduct this conversation in a civil way and to recognize that each of us are patriots, that each of us are Americans, and that, by the way, my proposals, as much as you may not like them, if you're a Republican or on the right, recognize that this is well within the mainstream of what Americans have been talking about for years in terms of making sure that everybody in this country gets decent health care and that people who have health care are protected.
Just to be clear, though,
Yeah.
it wasn't just President Carter. There are others in the Congressional Black Caucus, other thinkers who have said that they agree that there is racism out there in that opposition too. I just want to be clear. Are you saying to the former president and others to speak this way is counterproductive?
Well, look, David, here's what I'm saying. I think that the media loves to have a conversation about race. I mean, this is catnip to the media because it is a running thread in American history that's very powerful, and it evokes some very strong emotions. I'm not saying that race never matters in any of these public debates that we have. What I'm saying is this debate that's taking place is not about race, it's about people being worried about how our government should operate. Now, I think a lot of those folks on the other side are wrong. I think that they have entirely mischaracterized the nature of our efforts, and I think it's important that we stay focused on solving problems as opposed to plucking out a sentence here or a comment there, and then the entire debate, which should be about how do we make sure middle-class families have secure health care, doesn't get consumed by other things.
In that vein,
Yeah.
House Speaker Pelosi worried about the opposition, the tone of it perhaps leading to violence, as it did in the 70s. There's more recent examples of anti-government violence occurring even in the mid-90s. Do you worry about that?
Well, look, I think that we have an obligation in Washington as leaders to make sure that we are sending a strong message, that we can disagree without being disagreeable, without questioning each other's motives. When we start caricaturing the other side, I think that's a problem. Unfortunately, we've got, as I said before, a 24-hour news cycle where what gets you on the news is controversy. What gets you on the news is the extreme statement. The easiest way to get 15 minutes on the news or your 15 minutes of fame is to be rude. And that's something that I think has to change, and it starts with me, and I've tried to make sure that I've sent a clear signal, and I've tried to maintain an approach that says, look, we can have some serious disagreements, but at the end of the day, I'm assuming that you want the best for America just like I do.
You get a lot of airtime too, though, and your views are not rude. I don't think you'd
Well,
say.
you know, I do occupy a pretty special seat at the moment, but I do think that, look, I mean, let's face it. If you look at the news cycle over the last week, you know, it hasn't been the sensible people who, you know, very deliberately talk about the important issues that we face as a country. That's not the folks who've gotten a lot of coverage.
Let me ask you about another important issue facing you and your administration, and that is Afghanistan.
Yeah.
We've now been in Afghanistan for 8 years. The Soviets pulled out of Afghanistan after 10 years.
Right.
Are we committed to this war for an indefinite period of time, or do you think, in your mind, is there a deadline for withdrawal?
I don't have a deadline for withdrawal, but I'm certainly not somebody who believes in indefinite occupations of other countries. Keep in mind what happened when I came in. We had been adrift, I think, when it came to our Afghanistan strategy. And what I said was that we are going to do a top-to-bottom review of what's taking place there. Not just a one-time review, but we're going to do a review before the election in Afghanistan, and then we're going to do another review after the election. And we are going to see how this is fitting what I think is our core goal, which is to go after the folks who killed 3,000 Americans during 9/11 and who are still plotting to kill us, Al-Qaeda. How do we dismantle them, disrupt them, destroy them? Now, getting our strategy right in Afghanistan and in Pakistan are both important elements of that. But that's our goal, and I want to stay focused on that. And so right now, what's happened is that we've had an election in Afghanistan. It did not go as smoothly as I think we would have hoped, and there are some serious issues in terms of how the election was conducted in some parts of the country. But we've had that election. We now finally have the 21,000 troops in place that I had already ordered to go.
Are you skeptical about more troops, about sending more troops?
Well, can I just say this? I have to exercise skepticism anytime I send a single young man or woman in uniform into harm's way, because I'm the one who's answerable to their parents if they don't come home. So I have to ask some very hard questions anytime I send our troops in. The question that I'm asking right now is to our military, to General McChrystal, to General Petraeus, to all our national security apparatus, is whether it's troops who are already there or any troop requests in the future, how does this advance America's national security interests? How does it make sure that Al-Qaeda and its extremist allies cannot attack the United States homeland, our allies, our troops who are based in Europe? That's the question that I'm constantly asking, because that's the primary threat that we went there to deal with. And if supporting the Afghan national government and building capacity for their army and securing certain provinces advances that strategy, then we'll move forward. But if it doesn't, then I'm not interested in just being in Afghanistan for the sake of being in Afghanistan or saving face or in some way sending a message that America is here for the duration. I think it's important that we match strategy to resources. What I'm not also going to do, though, is put the resource question before the strategy question. Until I'm satisfied that we've got the right strategy, I'm not going to be sending some young man or woman over there beyond what we already have.
On a lighter note, before I let you go, Mr. President, you were brazen this summer at the All-Star game, wearing your Chicago White Sox jacket out there to throw out the first pitch. Hate to break it to you, but it doesn't look so good for your White Sox here. So I want to know, who is your pick to win the World Series?
You know, I think mathematically the White Sox can still get in the playoffs.
They can, mathematically.
So
you're an optimist.
Until they are eliminated, I will make no predictions.
Oh, come on.
I've got to say, though, that the Cardinals have been coming on strong. And Pujols is unbelievable.
He is.
But this is tough to say. The Yankees are also doing pretty well. And a shout out to Derek Jeter for breaking Lou Gehrig's record. He's a classic.
And now the view from the other side of the aisle. We're joined here in Washington by Congressman John Boehner and Senator Lindsey Graham. Welcome both of you back to Meet the Press. Maybe we'll get to baseball if there's time, but there's a lot of substantive issues, I think, in that interview that I want to go through with both of you. And let me start with this, Leader Boehner. It sounds like the president was trying to cool off this debate over government, over health care. He pointedly disagreed with former President Jimmy Carter, saying the opposition against him is not about race. But he also issued a challenge to Republicans, who he said are totally mischaracterizing the nature of our efforts. Your response?
Well, he said basically the same thing when he came to Capitol Hill and gave a speech. Took on the right for our descriptions of what they're trying to do. But if you step back and look at the bill that we have in the House, I'll let Lindsey talk about the Senate, it represents a giant takeover of our healthcare system. Now, there's no debate in Washington or around the country about the need for us to fix our healthcare system. It doesn't work well for everyone, and it costs too much. But we can fix our current system. We can make it work better. We don't have to throw it away and have this big government plan. It's all his.
Congressman Boehner, Senator Graham, thank you both very much. Up next, partisan politics continue. What are the risks to both sides? And is race a factor in some of the heated debate? Eugene Robinson and Roger Simon weigh in after this brief commercial break, only on Meet the Press.
Meet the Press is brought to you by Wells Fargo Advisors. Together, we'll go far. And by IBM. Let's build a smarter planet. Visit ibm.com/smarter planet.
We are back, joined now by Eugene Robinson of the Washington Post and Roger Simon. Welcome to both of you. A lot to talk about, certainly. Gene, the president made news in this interview in a few different areas. One is he pointedly disagreed with Jimmy Carter on the question of race. It's clear the White House does not want to have that conversation about race, but you'd like to, and you wrote about it this week, and the title of the column is Jimmy Carter Did Us All a Favor. You wrote in part, it seems clear to me that some, but not an overwhelming portion, as Jimmy Carter claimed, of the intensely demonstrated animosity toward Obama is indeed based on the fact that he is a black man. Of course, it's possible to reject Obama's policies and philosophy without being racist, but there's a particularly nasty edge to the most vitriolic attacks, a rejection not of Obama's programs, but of his legitimacy as president. I'm talking about the crazy birthers. I'm talking about the nitwits who arrive at protest rallies bearing racially offensive caricatures, idiots who toss around words like socialism to make Obama seem alien and even more dangerous. I look forward to the day when we can look past race. But before we can do so, we need to look at race and see it clearly. Jimmy Carter did us a favor. And yet the president says that this topic of race is like catnip for those of us in the media.
Yeah, what newspaper or website does Jimmy Carter report for? He's a former president. He's not the media. He brought this up, and I'm glad that he did, because I do think there is an edge to the criticism that is related to race, and I don't think it's the totality of the attacks on Obama. The country is concerned about the economy, about all the government spending, they're legitimately concerned about a lot of things. But this question of legitimacy, the question that somehow he doesn't deserve to be there, and it's you know, we had this wonderful kind of warm national feeling in January during the inaugural. He wants to be the leader of the party.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you both very much. And before we take a break here, I want to let you know about our newly redesigned interactive website. You can find more show video, transcripts, information on upcoming guests, plus my reporting and a link to my blog. Check it out at mtp.msnbc.com and let us know your thoughts. We'll be right back after this brief station break.
Bringing the world into sharper focus.
Did you steal this election?
Reporting the news and making headlines.
Racism. How worried are you?
Most watched, most honored. NBC News.
Note before we leave this morning, tune in this evening for About Our Children, an MSNBC live event featuring panelist Bill Cosby and hosted by Michelle Bernard. It's tonight on MSNBC at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. That's all for today. We'll be back next week. If it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press.
Get another chance to see David Gregory and the nation's top newsmakers on an encore presentation of Meet the Press